The Newsagents USA.
The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you gonna pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't wanna
you're a
answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question
you want to
is
put a lot of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is
justices,
the
radical
question-
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
This is.
It is 1,300 days since those two gents were last on stage together. Neither one has been in a debate since that fateful night in 2020. But next week, we're going to see the rematch. And boxing, it ain't.
You're going to see the 78-year-old pitted against the 81-year-old. One who claims he can ace his cognitive tests, the other who apparently wanders off. But are we getting a fair picture of either of them through that lens? Welcome to the Newsagents USA.
The Newsagents USA.
It's John.
It's Emily. And a little later in the episode, we're going to be talking about what's going on at the Washington Post, which now has a Brit in charge as their editor-in-chief. And we're going to be speaking to Harry Lambert, who writes for the Daily Beast and has done a long read into the clash of cultures between an investigative reporting team that actually wants to be talking about their own boss and might not be able to.
But we're going to start with Donald Trump, Joe Biden, the rematch. It's not the rumble in the jungle. It's not Ali Frazier. It's not the rematch at Madison Square Garden. It's going to be on a CNN debate stage where, interestingly, it's going to be run by very different rules from the brawl that we heard back in Cleveland in 2020, where everyone's mic is going to be cut except when they're speaking, which actually might work to Joe Biden's disadvantage, because that moment where he said, "Will you shut up, man?" was his best moment in that debate. And there's not going to be any of that because Trump is going to be silenced when Biden is speaking and vice versa.
Yeah, in a way, they've borrowed something from the COVID years when the last debate was held, in that there isn't going to be a live audience. They've decided not to have an audience, to have much stricter control over the mics, as Soaps is saying. And I wonder whether what you're going to see in the next week is Trump team playing down the idea that Joe Biden can't even get a sentence out without stumbling. Because actually, if they start to set the bar really low, if they say this guy can't get 2 words out, then if you do see a half-decent performance from Biden, as you did on that night of the State of the Union address, then suddenly it all looks better than expected. And I think that's what Team Trump now are trying to avoid. In a way, I think Trump has more to lose from this debate because Biden is not going in, because Team Biden are not expecting him to be the superstar shiny one.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting in the past week to take stock of 2 events where it shows the age, and I use the word age advisedly, of both of them.
Yeah.
There was a fundraising event in California. Joe Biden is on stage with Barack Obama. It is glitzy. There's a band playing in the background.
I mean, we should say, like, the other people there included Jimmy Kimmel, the comedian, Julia Roberts. It was Hollywood's finest. It was comedy's greatest, all the rest of it.
And it was going to raise a ton of money.
Yeah.
And you see there that they're on stage together, Biden and Obama. And sort of Biden seems to freeze. And Obama grabs his arm and takes him off stage slowly. And Biden doesn't look at the audience at all. He just sort of is heading, shuffling towards the exit, stage right. And you think, does Biden even know what's going on?
Yeah, I think we have to be really careful with some of this because right now there are clips that tell a whole story, there are clips that tell a partial story, and there are clips that are possibly being edited or doctored in a way that could be very, very helpful to the Trump team, to the MAGA crowd, because they make Biden look worse than he is. Now, I've watched that clip, and I agree with you. He seems to be sort of turned to stone until Obama takes his hand and off they go. In a way, you'd say, well, yeah, maybe he's trying to milk that moment. He's on stage with Obama. Maybe he's trying to milk that moment in front of a crowd that is then going to net him, I think it's $30 million in one night, for all it's worth. But I think you're now hearing the White House fight back this accusation that these were freezing moments or that they were moments where he'd wandered off. The other moment I think we should talk about is at the G7, where they're all kind of getting together. The leaders are all getting together for what they call the family photo. And as they're standing there sort of waiting, and Meloni is one of those, the Italian Prime Minister, Joe Biden looks as if he's wandering off. Now, if you edit the video at the point where he turns his back to the leaders, you just think, oh my God, this looks like a guy with Alzheimer's who started leaving his house and going for a little walk. If you show the whole frame, you see him bending down and actually talking to, I think, a parachute pilot, a guy who's literally on the ground packing up a parachute. And you think, well, maybe this is a guy who's genuinely interested, in how this stuff is working. And he likes to talk to the public and he's engaging. So I think there are two things going on which aren't necessarily contradictory. One is that he is a bit slower. We know that. He is a bit more fragile on stage. He does take longer to react. And the other is that there is a team ready to capitalise on that by editing the videos in a way that make him look worse than he is.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the right analysis, because I think, look, if you just say there is no issue, Joe Biden's absolutely fine, I think you're being utterly dishonest.
Crazy.
And if you say he's absolutely, totally 100% gaga, that's not right either. He is in decline. This is how White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre reacted to it all.
Especially worried about the fact that this appears to be a pattern that we're seeing more of often.
Yeah, and I think you all have called this the cheap fakes video, and that's exactly what they are. They are cheap fakes video. They are done in bad faith, and some of your news organization have been very clear, have stressed that these the right wing critics of the president have a credibility problem because of the fact checkers have repeatedly caught them pushing misinformation, disinformation, and so we see this, and this is something coming from your part of the world, calling them cheap fakes and misinformation. And I'll quote the Washington Post, where they wrote about this, and they said how Republicans use misleading videos to attack Biden in a 24-hour period. And to their credit, we have a conservative Washington Examiner did call them out as well, calling out the New York Post. Ironically, several recent cheap fakes actually attack the president for thanking troops. That is what they're attacking the president for.
OK, so
and again,
I will say she sounds quite defensive there. And I guess one of the reasons that Karine Jean-Pierre is pushing back so defensively is because the biggest influence now on social media comes from, I think, 3 or 4 hard right voices, or let's say Trump voices. Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist, people who have got no scruples about spreading misinformation about what's going on in the campaign at every available opportunity. And that phrase that she's chosen, cheap fakes, is in itself quite naughty, because she can't actually call them deep fakes because the videos are real. So instead of calling them deep fakes, she calls them cheap fakes, meaning they're kind of real, but they've been edited to make you think something or other. You have to say, if the White House wasn't nervous about this, they probably wouldn't be going out sounding quite so defensive and batting quite so hard to try and make publications change the way they were sharing this stuff.
No, I spoke to someone who was involved in the D-Day stuff and who'd spent a bit of time with Biden. And apparently there were moments where he seemed slightly lost, and then he kind of, something would click in and he would be back in it. So, he is 81 years old. He is jet lagged when he's flown over Europe. But you can't pretend it's not an issue, his age. And the alarm is felt as much by Democrats as anyone else. And although there are some people who say, just don't talk about it, you're just making things worse by raising it, it's hard to ignore it when people are being asked to vote for him in November as the president for the next 4 years.
Yeah, so I think what you've seen from Trump on the campaign recently is this urge to absolutely go for the jugular, to take the to capitalise, take the mickey. whilst bearing in mind that they don't want to lower the bar so much that he looks quite good on the debate stage next week. Trump is here trying to boast about his own cognitive capabilities in a test that he took a few years ago.
He doesn't even know what the word inflation means. I don't think if you gave him a quiz, I think he should take a cognitive test like I did. I took a cognitive test and I aced it. Doc Ronnie Johnson. Does everyone know Ronnie Johnson, congressman from Texas? He was the White House doctor.
Yeah, he was the White House doctor. But sorry, Donald, wrong name. It was Ronnie Jackson, not Ronnie Johnson. And this is Jon Stewart's take on it.
I guess the election has basically boiled down to each candidate accusing the other of having soup where there should be brain. There is plenty of fodder for the attacks. For instance, for President Biden, it is his habit of seemingly staring at what can only be considered ghosts or out-of-frame paratroopers, and then, when he's pulled back into frame, somehow giving the impression someone has just quantum leaped into his body. Is that... No, don't look directly at the sun, sir. That would... Now, and as for Trump, basically it's Trump tripping over his own dick anytime he tries to capitalize on Biden's age. Like this weekend, Trump appeared at the Herbalife of political conventions, Turning Point USA, where Trump articulated his case for having best brainful neurons.
So at the precise moment, while you are trying to show how much more cognitively intact you are to Joe Biden, you get the bloody name wrong of the person who you're kind of heralding as the person who showed that you were cognitively brilliant. You couldn't make it up.
You know, there's dementia tests where you go to the GP and they actually start by saying, I'm going to give you a name and I'm going to ask you at the end of our appointment if you still remember the name. It's almost like Donald Trump has taken that test and flunked it.
Yeah,
live
and
on stage.
it's not just that he names Ronnie Johnson once. He does it a number, Ronnie Johnson, this, Ronnie Johnson. No, it's Ronnie Jackson. That's the guy who was the White House doctor, who is now a congressman in Texas and fully paid up member of the MAGA crowd.
So this is the stage being set. But one other area that could get quite complicated is who else is on that debate stage. Because in the wings, in the rumblings, is one Robert Kennedy Jr. He is the third wheel in this campaign because he's standing as an independent. Yes, there are others. We should explain there are others. But he is the one who at the moment is just around the 15% mark that makes him almost viable to be a player in the debates. And that could totally, radically change the whole dynamic.
It could. And he will be the disruptor. And it's unclear who he poses the greatest threat to, whether it is Donald Trump or whether it is Joe Biden. Look, the Kennedy name is obviously, the preeminent family of democratic politics for the past 60 years. So, yeah, that is a huge name to have, and that will appeal to a lot of Democrats. On the other hand, he's an anti-vaxxer. He's a bit of a conspiracy theorist.
He admitted that he had a worm in his brain.
Yeah. And so he's that attracts an awful lot of the Trump crowd.
I mean, it's quite the beauty pageant, isn't it? Up there on the stage.
But if you're going to make the comparison, and it's a kind of obvious one to make, and it's like, we always compare Farage to Trump because
I was going to say he's Nick Clegg. I think that's probably
I think that Nick Clegg could probably sue you for the comparison that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is Nick Clegg. No, I think that he is the Farage figure in the November election in the US because he is standing there as the kind of outsider who wants to pick up the disaffected. And there are a lot of people who feel disaffected with Trump, and there are a lot of people who feel disaffected with Biden.
Isn't that the perfect sort of full circle that Donald Trump, who tried in 2016, even though he was, of course, absolutely central to the establishment of New York and the business world and, the Dow Jones and all the rest of it, tried to run as this outsider, and he now faces somebody else coming in and being the person who wants to make him look the insider, who wants to make... I mean, this is the first time, obviously, that we've had two former presidents on stage together. All Robert Kennedy Jr. has to say is, look at your record, I'm going to do things better.
I'm not either of you.
I'm not either of you.
And that could really work for Robert F. Kennedy. You know, he looks like a Kennedy. He sounds like a Kennedy. He isn't much of a Kennedy in terms of his policies, but there is a kind of presence there that he has. He's got big financial backing. He chose his VP pick extremely well, a billionaire.
What was it that first attracted you to your
the
VP?
billionaire, exactly. And so, you know, look, if he's on the debate stage, you kind of think all bets are off. And at the start, when Robert F. Kennedy was running, Trumpland put a lot of money in behind him because they thought it would hurt Biden. And now they're not so sure. So we have got a new dynamic, explosive element in this campaign, as if it wasn't confusing enough.
In a moment, we'll be talking about Washington Post, the beacon of investigative journalism in America, and the rumblings of unhappiness in that newsroom right now.
There is an extraordinary battle going on at the heart of American media, at the most preeminent name, I guess, in American journalism, the Washington Post, the paper that broke Watergate and the scandal around it. It is celebrated. It has won so many Pulitzer Prizes that they could line the walls with them. And yet there is a battle going on over the new publisher, who is British, Will Lewis, previously of The Telegraph, previously of the Murdoch stable as well, who has gone in there to shake things up and to try and turn round the Washington Post and make it more profitable. But some of his past is coming back to haunt him, and he doesn't want to talk about it. He's given no quotes, and there is an open revolt almost now at the Post among its journalists who are saying, who is this interloper that we have brought in from London? He's got to go.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We talk so much about American media, meaning the cable channels, the Fox Newsification, the way that sort of area of the media is so dominant and so influential on voters' minds. And yet we don't actually talk about the papers very much, partly, I guess, because they do have a declining influence. But the Washington Post was bought a few years ago by Jeff Bezos of Amazon fame. And Jeff Bezos has been very much a sort of hands-off owner. And Will Lewis was brought in to basically be the guy who turned it around. Now, Harry Lambert, who writes for the Daily Beast, has been looking into the story of what's happened, really, with Will Lewis, how he kind of got to this position, because it's not many Brits, I think, that really break through into American media jobs, right? And what have you found?
So I think Will is actually part of this whole brigade of Brits who are taking over American media, but he's the one that they're trying to get rid of. And I think there's no secret at this point that the newsroom in both the Washington Post, but also really across all of the Eastern media landscape, New York Times and others, they're in open revolt against Will. And I think, our fear with this story was that he was going to have to resign before we were able to publish it. That's the state at which it's got to. And it's gotten here because I think two things, really. One is he's taken this position where he said, for better or worse, I'm not going to discuss what I did working for Rupert Murdoch.
This goes back to the phone hacking
in
era.
the early 2010s, exactly.
Not that he was accused of phone hacking, but that he was the fixer kind of thing. He was the guy who smoothed things over for Murdoch when the Murdoch empire was going through these
sort of like Winston the Wolf in Pulp Fiction, brought in to clear up the mess. And as a friend put it himself, a friend of Will. So that's not our point of view. And I think the point to say is that Will, in the 90s and the 2000s, was a rising star in journalism. He was at the FT, star reporter, broke the ExxonMobil merger, made his name, went to the Sunday Times. He wasn't involved in phone hacking at all. In fact, he was the editor of The Telegraph when they broke the expenses story. So really, by 2010, he's a sort of soaring figure in the British media landscape, 41 years old. But he loses control at The Telegraph, sort of busts out prematurely because he sets up his own little unit within it, which he tries to run as a sort of digital media company within The Telegraph. It leads to him losing power totally. And Murdoch is the guy that picks him up and brings him in at a low ebb. And the comparison that I think is apt to make for any Succession fans is he's sort of Tom Wormsgams. He's the guy who...
You can't make a tomlet without breaking Greg's. This is what he does, right? He gets rid of the dirty papers. He gets rid of the evidence.
Well, we've got to be clear. I mean, we don't know that, but these are the allegations that are being made in court documents in London.
I only meant Tom does.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got to declare here that I've known Will for years and years and years and years and years.
Right.
And I know his brother even better. He's not Tom Wormsgams in the sense that he is a very charming, funny, outrageous, loud, one of the gang. But, there is a cultural problem that Will has got, is that Will is very British. Even though he had worked for Dow Jones Index for Murdoch before it kind of, was the last big job he had in the US, he is very, very British. And there is a sort of cultural snobbery, I think, in Washington among journalists who think that the First Amendment gives them this sort of hallowed status and revered, and they kind of think that, who is this Will Lewis
guy?
Wait
a sec, didn't this come to a head when one of the Washington Post reporters said, I'm going to be writing, doing a deep dive on phone hacking and on Will Lewis's past, and he apparently, or allegedly, tried to stop that happening.
Exactly. So the key thing that happened here is that he was basically trying to get rid of the previous editor, or certainly move her on to a different role within the company. And she started running stories, or the Post started running stories into Lewis's past. And he tried to dampen those down. And we do know as a fact that the newsletter chief within the organisation, when the story did go out about Lewis, said you shouldn't be putting this in your newsletters. And that clearly seems to have come from Lewis himself. So there's been this repeated effort to either not answer questions about it or damp it down when it is being covered. And as is always the case, if you tell people not to look into something, then they begin to do so.
But that again underlines the cultural difference. That in a British newspaper setting, if you've got the backing of the proprietor and you don't want to be investigated, and you look at the way newspaper editors of rival publications don't report on each other, tend not to. You don't on someone else's doorstep. It's the code of newspaper editors that you don't do that. That does not exist in America. And again, it underlines that thing that, Will is from a British media culture, and the Washington establishment culture is not like that.
Yeah, but the Washington Post is about public records, isn't it? It's
of
about
course.
going in and finding your primary sources. It's not about lunching and lobbying, which I think is more...
And cutting deals.
Right.
Well, just the other thing about the Post I'd mention is, look, this is the paper that broke Watergate, a long running cover-up that took years for them to uncover. And I think that so many reporters there revere Woodward and Bernstein, and they think of themselves as modern day ones.
And so, Catherine Graham before, was the one who put the Pentagon Papers out, right? So she started, that was kind of really early 70s as well. Watergate was 72, didn't break till sort of later. But Catherine Graham really started this whole process of saying we're not going to be told what to do by government, by the security services, by people in power, essentially.
Absolutely. And I think that Post element is crucial here, which is the last place that wants to facilitate a cover-up or allow their publisher to get away with something is the Washington Post.
Yeah.
The other interesting aspect of what has happened to Will is the importance of what gave him the prize in UK journalism of the Editor of the Year, which was MP's expenses. The Telegraph paid money to get hold of that file, the memory stick with all the details of MP's expenses. And that seems to be the major ethical breach that the Washington Post can't tolerate, because in American journalism, you don't pay for stories.
I know, and I think that's really quite mistaken of them. I would have paid for it, and I think that the reality is that wasn't actually a big deal. People looked askance at it, but for 6 months they had no problem with it. It was only when Will refused, or rather tried to damp down coverage of his Murdoch past, that everything suddenly became a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do agree with you on that. In terms of Will being likeable, everyone emphasised to me, even critics of Will, that he is a great fun to be around, and that he wouldn't have charmed 3 billionaire benefactors and got what he has gotten if he wasn't charming. So there's clearly a likability to Will, and
that's where we've been going wrong.
Exactly. We're just not likeable. We've got no charm.
Yeah.
And so where does it go?
Well, I think,
can he survive this?
Look, Jeff Bezos is the only person that matters here, but I think Bezos doesn't really want to have the media an open revolt against him. And if there's this sort of drum roll of people saying he's got to go, which is what's happening, I'd be amazed if he survives long.
Can I just tell that extraordinary story about Jeff Bezos, which was that he was threatened by the Daily Inquirer, who said he had dick pics of Bezos, and Bezos decided to publish his own. I mean, literally published a picture of his own penis because he didn't want to be threatened or in hoc to a tabloid newspaper. Now that, I mean, it's kind of a level of bravery that I think would astonish, most people, but it also suggests he probably has short shrift with an editor who can't be as transparent as he has been.
But that's how you kill a story, right?
Right.
The big problem with Lewis is he's not responding to anything here. And if you do that, all the people are going to do is investigate more of your past.
Harry, brilliant to have you in.
Thanks
Thank
for
you so
having me.
much.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. A name we haven't discussed much on the podcast is Wes Moore. He's the Democratic governor of Maryland, and people are seeing him as a future superstar in Democratic politics. And overnight, he has issued a pardon to 175,000 people in the state who had minor offences for marijuana, and said, you know what, marijuana has been legalised in the state now as a result of a kind of ballot. We're going to wipe these sentences from your record so that you no longer have that sort of criminal background because you once possessed marijuana.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting move.
Well, also, what he said was that it was an opportunity to right a lot of historical wrongs. And his Attorney General took this one further and said that the pardons were long overdue as a nation because it was a racial equality issue. And I think, what they're essentially saying is that they tended to incarcerate more young black men for possession of marijuana than middle-class white people. So it becomes an imbalance in racial terms. And it's worth remembering Joe Biden, who in the 1990s, as a senator, was behind a campaign that made it much more punitive to have crack than to have cocaine. And what that did was skew the prison population again towards young black men. And it was called out as a sort of racially offensive policy. And it's taken Joe Biden himself quite a lot of time, quite a lot of years to get that behind him. Say, actually, I fess up, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have made that differentiation between cocaine, i.e. nice, white, middle class drug for the rich, and crack, which was seen as sort of low level, street junk, basically. And so I think the fact that they are on the front foot here is not just about freeing up places in prison. It's about saying, we get this, we get the race issue. And that is something that Biden really needs to do because he's going after the black vote in a way that he's never had to before, because Trump is making inroads into young black men. And
Emily, when we were in Washington kind of 3 months ago, whenever it was, and we were talking to kind of,
Steve Bannon.
Yeah. They are absolutely targeting young black men for the Republican Party. And it was a demographic that previously wouldn't have gone anywhere near the Republican Party.
Yeah,
they're considering now that they're doing it. And Trump land thinks they're doing pretty well now.
Well, the latest polling in Michigan shows that Trump believes he's got 20% of the black vote, which is astonishing. And it could well be the difference between Trump getting Michigan or Biden getting Michigan, and Michigan is kind of the centre of the universe when it comes to the race for the White House.
I think the money that will be spent in Michigan in this election cycle will be off the scale because it is so important. If Trump is going to win back Arizona and Georgia and possibly take Nevada as well, then Biden has to hold on to Michigan. Yeah. And there are all sorts of reasons to think that he can't. So we started off with Wes Moore and what happened in Maryland. And we've gone
We should say that Maryland is a safe blue seat.
Yeah.
So this is not, part of the election battle, but I think it's about the perception.
Exactly. And that's why that what has happened in Maryland overnight has a wider resonance and about the recognition of democratic politics, that they need to start worrying about where the black vote is going.
That's all from us. We'll be back next week and we'll have a special episode for you after that debate.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents USA.